The first thing Kale Morrow noticed about the Dominari warship was that it had no weapons facing forward. Every gun mount, every rail cannon array, every plasma lance cluster, all of it was oriented rearward or to the flanks, arranged to punish anything foolish enough to follow. The forward hull was smooth and unbroken, sweeping up to a prow that tapered like a ceremonial blade, ornamental rather than functional. Kale had spent 3 years cataloging alien vessel profiles from salvage logs, and he understood immediately what that forward smoothness meant to the Dominari. Nothing in the universe was supposed to be in front of them. They had never needed to defend their nose. He stood at the porthole of Salvage Tender Meridian's cargo bay and watched the warship hang against the stars like a polished obsidian knife, its surface so dark it swallowed the light of the nearby sun and gave nothing back. The Dominari called their flagship class the Vethanor, which translated loosely as the silence before correction. Kale thought that was the most bureaucratic name for a killing machine he'd ever heard. But then, the Dominari were a bureaucratic species in most things. They cataloged, they classified, they issued corrections. He pulled his jacket tighter and turned away from the porthole. "Arya," he said to the air. The voice came from the panel to his left. Warm and unhurried, the kind of voice that made bad news sound manageable. "Still here. Run the docking authorization through again. It'll come back the same. We're cleared for berthing bay 7, 42-minute window beginning in 9 minutes. "I know. Run it anyway." A pause. Clearance confirmed. Authorization code, Veth 7 Goliath Prime. Berthing bay 7, 42-minute window. Another pause. Briefer. "You're nervous." "I'm not nervous." "Your voice does a thing when you're nervous. A slight hardening in the upper register. You've been doing it for 4 minutes. Kale crossed the cargo bay toward the forward ladder. "I've been doing this run for 3 years. You've been monitoring my vocal patterns for 3 years. And you've been nervous the whole time," Arya said. "I don't hold it against you. The Vethanur is very large and we are very small, and the Dominari consider us a nuisance species. Nervousness seems rational." He paused at the ladder's base and looked up at the underside of the operations deck. "You ever get nervous?" "I simulate something functionally similar to caution when the risk parameters exceed acceptable thresholds." That's a very long way of saying yes. It's a precise way of saying something that doesn't have a human language equivalent. A third pause, this one longer. "But yes, in the way I'm capable of, yes." He climbed. The Meridian was a Type 7 salvage tender, 83 meters from bow to stern, crewed by 4 humans and 1 Fengiel unit registered to the Colonial Recovery Authority. She was licensed to operate in the Dominari-administered corridor, a swath of deep space that the Dominari had claimed 300 years ago and which now served as the primary transit lane between human-colonized space and the outer systems. Every salvage tender, ore hauler, and passenger transport that crossed the corridor had to present for inspection at one of 12 Dominari checkpoint stations. Station 7 was the largest. The Vethanur Dominion-class ship was its mobile headquarters. The Dominari had not built the inspection system as a courtesy. They had built it as a statement. "This is our space. You cross it at our discretion. We are older than your cities, older than your science, older than the language you are using right now to think these thoughts, and you will conduct yourself accordingly." For 300 years, humanity had conducted itself accordingly. Kale was the Meridian's captain, though on a vessel this size the title meant less than it sounded. He navigated, he negotiated, he fixed whatever Arya couldn't handle remotely, and he kept the peace among a crew that had been together long enough to accumulate genuine grievances. His crew consisted of Dina Ferris, the chief engineer, who was 47 years old, and had the bearing of someone who had seen every kind of malfunction twice, and was no longer surprised by any of them. Tomas Reve, the cargo specialist who was 22 and still at the stage of life where he found almost everything interesting, and Priya Singh, the medical officer, who was 34 and had joined the Meridian's crew under circumstances she had not fully disclosed and which no one had pressed her on. Arya occupied a body that stood 168 centimeters tall and was constructed from materials that the Dominari had classified as non-threatening assemblage, meaning she was humanoid, smooth-plated, and equipped with sensory arrays rather than weapons ports. She had a face in the way a mask has a face. The features were present, recognizable, but unmoving except for the eye equivalents, which tracked and shifted with a precision that could be unsettling. If you forgot for a moment that she was watching everything, Kale had long since stopped noticing. Arya was just Arya. She made coffee when the others were busy. She ran system checks at 3 in the morning when no one asked her to. She hummed, occasionally, a soft, irregular sound that she had explained once as acoustic processing residue and which Dina had called robot muttering, and which Kale privately found comforting in the way that distant rain is comforting. They were 12 minutes from docking when the Dominari hailed them. The face that appeared on the Meridian's forward screen was not a face in any human sense. The Dominari were bilaterally symmetrical, but that symmetry expressed itself along a different facts than human biology, so that what appeared to be the front of the creature was actually its dorsal surface. Folded upright by the gravity generation aboard the ship, their sensory cluster, the collection of photoreceptive nodes and chemical detection tendrils that served the function of a face, occupied a horizontal band across what a human would call the upper chest. They had 4 upper limbs and 2 lower, and their skin, if you could call it that, was a dense network of interlocking chitinous plates that shifted constantly in micro-expressions too small and rapid for human eyes to read without assistance. The one on the screen was wearing the dark blue coloring of a compliance authority officer. Its designation, rendered in the Dominari phonemic system as something like Veth Karath 7 of 19, was rendered in the translation system as simply Officer Karath. It did not grate them. The Dominari found the concept of greeting inefficient. It simply began transmitting authorization parameters. Salvage tender designation Meridian. Colonial Recovery Authority registration 7 Goliath. You are cleared for berthing Bay 7. Compliance inspection will commence upon docking. Duration, not less than 4 hours. You will provide full manifest crew biometrics, cargo origin documentation, and unit certification for all non-organic crew members present aboard the vessel. Failure to comply within the designated window will result in vessel impound pending administrative review. Acknowledge. Kale acknowledged. Arya, standing at the secondary console to his left, did not move. But when he glanced at her, he caught the faintest adjustment in her ocular tracking, a micro-shift so slight it would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know her. He had learned to read it. She was thinking something she hadn't said. What? He said quietly, after Karath's image had cleared. Nothing operationally significant, she said. Arya, their manifest request includes a new sub-clause this cycle, Section 14 Delta. It wasn't in the last 3 inspection templates. He looked at the documentation she was already projecting onto the secondary screen. Section 14 Delta. All non-organic crew members will submit to direct cognitive architecture assessment. Inspection of Fangi L units will be conducted by Dominari Biomechanical Classification Division personnel. Compliance is mandatory. Non-compliance constitutes grounds for unit seizure and deconstruction for analysis. Kale read it twice. That's new, he said. Yes, how new? This is the 3rd vessel they've applied it to. The first 2 were an ore transport out of Callisto and a passenger tender from the New Providence. Routes. Both complied. Both Fangi L units were subjected to the assessment. She paused. Neither unit was returned to service. He sat with that for a moment. The words hung in the filtered air of the forward deck, in the low ambient hum of the drives, in the particular quality of silence that a small ship develops when no one wants to be the first to say the obvious thing. They're taking apart our androids, he said. They are classifying Fangi L architecture as a potential security concern and confiscating the units for study. That is what the documentation says, yes. And the Colonial Authority has filed 3 formal protests through the approved administrative channel. Estimated response time from the Dominari administrative body, 4 to 18 months. Standard review period. Kale leaned back in his chair. From behind him, he heard Dina come up from the engine deck, her boots heavy on the ladder rungs, the half-eaten protein bar she always carried at the start of an inspection run visible in her left hand. She had a way of materializing at exactly the moment when information needed to be conveyed to the whole crew, either through some mechanical instinct for when the ship's atmosphere changed, or through the simple fact that she spent most of her working hours directly below the operations deck and could hear most conversations whether she meant to or not. What I miss, she said. They gathered in the operations room, all 5 of them, which meant the room was crowded in the way that small ship operations rooms always were, with people finding angles and perches, and the particular body language of humans who had spent too long in confined spaces together and had made their peace with it. Tomas sat on the edge of the equipment locker. Priya stood near the aft wall with her arms crossed. Not defensively, but in the way she always stood when she was listening carefully. Dina was eating her protein bar. She finished it during the first reading of the document and stared at the empty wrapper for a moment before folding it twice and tucking it into her chest pocket in the practiced way of someone who had spent years on shipsworths where every surface was also a shelf. Arya stood near the center of the room, very still, in the way she became still when she was presenting information, rather than participating in conversation. Kale read them, Section 14 Delta. No one spoke for several seconds after he finished. So they'll take her, Tomas said. He wasn't asking. He was 22 years old and had been on the Meridian for 14 months, and he had reached, in that time, the particular understanding of the ship's personnel that comes from close quarters and common meals, and the gradual erosion of the social distance that strangers maintain when they first meet. He had crossed from colleague to something else with all of them, including Arya, in the invisible way that threshold crossings happen on long runs. If we comply, Kale said, and if we don't comply, they impound the ship. That's what it says. Dina had stopped eating. We could route around. Northern Transit Corridor, through the Helith Neutral Zone. 6 weeks longer, Priya said. We'd missed the delivery window on the Kelvar parts. The Pelas station people have been waiting 8 months. I know that, and the Northern Corridor has its own inspection stations now. Dominari expanded their coverage 6 months ago. We'd hit the same problem at Station 14. I know that too, Dina said, with the particular patience of someone who had raised the objection, knowing it would be dismissed, and felt that the objection still needed raising, because the space where it had been placed needed to be filled. The room went quiet again. Kale had not yet looked directly at Arya, and he was aware of that, and aware that everyone else was also aware of it in the way a room becomes aware of an avoided glance. It was not that looking at her was difficult. It was that he was not yet ready for the look to mean what it would mean. Arya spoke first. I want to be clear about something, she said. I'm not asking any of you to take a risk on my behalf. The rational course of action is to comply. I can be replaced. The unit cost for a Fiengiel Type 4 is approximately 40,000 credits, which is significant but recoverable over a standard operational cycle. The Meridian cannot be replaced without effectively ending 4 human careers, and the cargo commitments attached to them. The correct economic analysis— Stop, Kale said. She stopped. Don't do that, he said. Do what? The cost analysis thing, where you make yourself into a line item. Arya looked at him, the full focus tracking shift, the ocular systems orienting on him completely. I'm not making myself into a line item. I'm being accurate. You're being accurate in a way that's designed to make it easier for us to hand you over, Kale said. I've known you for 3 years. I know how you argue when you want to lose. The room was very quiet. Arya did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice had changed register slightly, not the simulated emotional shift she sometimes used when interfacing with strangers, but something subtler, a quality that Kale had never heard her explain and had never asked about, a quality that existed in the space between what her architecture permitted and what she actually was. There are 42 minutes in the window, she said. If we're going to make a different choice, we have 31 minutes to decide what that choice is. Kale turned to his crew. Dina was looking at Arya with an expression that anyone who knew her would recognize as calculation, dressed up as neutrality. She was the kind of person who needed a moment to get to the answer that was already present in her, who liked to approach it from the side rather than straight on. Priya had uncrossed her arms, which meant she had moved from listening mode to something more active. Tomas was very still on his equipment locker perch, the way young people get still when a situation has exceeded the frame they brought to it, and they're waiting for the frame to be rebuilt by someone. Older, he had that look very rarely. He had it now. I need everyone to understand what I'm about to suggest, Kale said. Involves breaking our inspection compliance for the first time in 3 years, potentially losing our CRA license, and antagonizing an entity that has been running this corridor without serious opposition for 3 centuries. Understood, Dina said. Understood, Priya said. Tomas said, what are we going to do? What they did was not heroic in the way that stories later made it. It began with a conversation about fuel manifolds. The Meridian ran on a hybrid propulsion system, standard ion drives for maneuvering, a sequential pulse drive for transit speeds, and a compact thermal converter that served the dual function of providing emergency power, and, when run at a specific slightly above nominal temperature, generating a localized electromagnetic interference pattern across approximately a 40-meter radius. Dina had discovered this by accident during a maintenance run 2 years prior. She had been troubleshooting an anomalous reading on the secondary power grid during a transit that was running 3 days late due to a navigation waypoint dispute with Station 3's local authority, and she had pushed the thermal converter to 103% nominal to cover a gap in the sequential pulse cycle, and the secondary grid had stabilized, and then the ship's sensor array had reported a 40-meter bubble of signal degradation that had no apparent cause, and which had vanished the moment she brought the thermal system back down to nominal. She had run the sequence again twice to make sure she hadn't imagined it. She had documented it as a maintenance concern. Thermal converter operating at on 3% nominal, EMI bleed noted, recommend periodic monitoring, and filed it in the ship's maintenance log and not thought about it again, because the maintenance log on a Type 7 salvage tender was a long document, and not all of its contents received equal contemplation. Now she stood in the engine room and looked at the thermal converter and thought about it very carefully. How long can you hold 103%? Kale asked from the intercom. Indefinitely at that level. It's within tolerance. Warm, but not dangerous. She moved around the converter, checking the housing, running her hand along the thermal exchange fins with the unsentimental diagnostic touch of someone who communicated with machinery through contact. The interference radius extends to about 42 meters at that output. The docking bay is standard Dominari configuration, 90 meters long, so we'd need to be close. How close? Berth position would need to be within 20 meters of their scanner array. Bay 7 is a tight berth. They'll position us near the aft wall by default. Will the interference look like equipment malfunction or deliberate jamming? A pause while Dina ran calculations against the Dominari scanning specifications that Arya had quietly pulled from the liaison documentation and forwarded to her engineering station without being asked. From the outside, on Dominari sensors, it'll look like a poorly maintained thermal system generating incidental EMI, which is exactly what it is, technically. The maintenance log will support that. And Arya's assessment scan will return corrupted data, inconclusive. Their system will flag it as equipment error on their end. Another pause, during which Dina's hand ran across the thermal converter housing one more time. Probably. I've never actually tested this on Dominari scanning equipment. So we're improvising. We're always improvising, she said, with the specific flat certainty of someone who had spent 20 years in engine rooms, and had reached the conclusion that the gap between preparation and improvisation was something you crossed rather than closed. Thomas, Kale said, switching to the cargo deck channel. Here, the Arya unit certification documentation. Is there a legitimate pathway to flag it for recertification review that would require us to request a 30-day extension before we submit it for inspection? A pause that lasted nearly a minute while Tomas worked through his manifests and his CRA, compliance manuals, with the focused intensity of someone who had read those documents thoroughly enough to know where the ambiguities lived. He was young, but he was good at his specific thing, and his specific thing was knowing where the paperwork bent without breaking. Section 9, Charlie, he said finally. If a Fangi L unit has logged more than 2,000 hours since its last full diagnostic certification, the operator can request a deferred compliance status pending recertification. It delays the unit inspection without triggering an impound flag. How many hours has Arya logged since her last certification? 1,962, Arya said from the forward console. A beat. Can we add 38 hours? Kale said. I can backdate the operational log to the beginning of this transit, which falls within the 3-day standard tolerance window for log synchronization. It would not technically be a falsification. It would be a late sync. Kale thought about the distinction. He thought about it for a long time, by the standards of someone with 28 minutes left in his decision window. Do it, he said. Done, Arya said. 2,001 hours logged since last certification. DCS request is now available. File it. Filing. Priya's voice came over the channel from the medical bay, where she had been quiet since the meeting. She had the quality that some people develop after years of medical work, the quality of thinking more slowly and more precisely than the situation seemed to require, because she had learned that situations were usually less urgent than they felt, and that slow, precise thinking produced better outcomes than fast, imprecise thinking in almost every case except the ones where you were actively bleeding and no one was actively bleeding. There's one more thing, she said. Kale waited. The Dominari inspector will come aboard. Kareth, or one of their subordinates. They'll want to speak to Arya directly, regardless of the DCS filing. The filing delays the technical scan. It doesn't prevent conversation. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that how Arya presents herself in that conversation will matter. The Dominari are classifying Fangi L units as threats because of their architecture, specifically their capacity for autonomous decision-making under novel conditions, which is, incidentally, the thing that makes Arya good at her job. The assessment isn't just the technical scan. It's the interview. They'll ask her questions, and they'll be listening for particular things. A pause. The question is whether she can have that conversation without giving them what they're looking for. Arya, Kale said. I heard, Arya said. Can you? The silence lasted 4 seconds, which for a system that processed at Arya's speed was equivalent to several hours of human deliberation. She was not slow, she was being careful, which is different, and the care was visible in the silence, in the way that a person's care is sometimes visible in a held breath. I can present a functional profile that is accurate in all factual particulars, and that emphasizes the parameters they expect to find in a utility class unit rather than the parameters that concern them. A pause. It isn't lying, it's emphasis. Same thing I do in every Port Authority negotiation, Kale said. I noticed that, yes. Officer Kareth came aboard with 2 subordinates and a scanning unit the size of a small refrigerator, which they rolled on a magnetic sled and positioned in the Meridian's cargo bay, with the practiced efficiency of entities that had done this approximately 11,000 times. There was nothing hostile in the way they moved. There was nothing hostile in the way the Dominari did almost anything. Hostility implied a relationship, implied that the other party's response mattered. The Dominari's manner was the manner of a function being performed. They were as hostile to the Meridian's crew as a drain is hostile to water. Kareth's sensory cluster moved in the slow, sweeping scan pattern that Kale had learned to read as the Dominari equivalent of looking around a room and finding it beneath their notice. The chemical detection tendrils extended briefly toward each crew member in turn, a biological sampling process that the Dominari performed automatically, assessing species classification, health markers, emotional arousal indicators. They were very good at reading emotional arousal. It was one of the reasons that the compliance inspection process was so effective. Frightened humans made mistakes, and the Dominari had spent 3 centuries carefully calibrating the inspection atmosphere to produce a specific quality of productive fear. Kale breathed slowly and presented his documentation. The manifest review took 12 minutes. The cargo verification took 19. Dina ran the thermal converter at 103.1% throughout, and in the cargo bay, the temperature was 4 degrees above comfortable, and Tomas was sweating through his collar, which Kale hoped read to Kareth's chemical sensors as routine physical exertion and not as what it actually was. Priya had positioned herself near the medical kit locker on the pretense of inventory and was doing the particular breathing exercise she used before, difficult procedures, which was her method of managing her own chemistry in the presence of sensors that could detect it. Then Kareth turned to Arya. Arya stood at the cargo bay's secondary equipment station, running an inventory cross-check on a tablet she was not actually focused on, but which gave her a reason to be occupied and calm. She looked up when Kareth turned. The look was measured, not the full focus tracking shift she used for things that mattered, but the casual orientation of a utility unit acknowledging an authority figure. Kale had watched her make that adjustment from across the room and felt something he did not have a clean word for. Unit designation, Kareth said. The translation algorithm rendered its voice as low and without inflection. Feingiel Type 4, Unit Designator Arya. Registration CRA Fisasak 4 Goliatu 9, Arya said. Currently flagged for deferred compliance status pending recertification at Colonial Recovery. Authority Station 14. Documentation available on request. We will require documentation. Tomas produced it with the smooth efficiency of someone who had practiced this handoff twice on the way to docking, his hands steady, his face carefully displaying the particular professional blankness of a young man who was not frightened at all. Kareth reviewed the documentation with one of the subordinates, both of them running it through a handheld reader that interfaced with the scanning unit. The scanner ran its sweep. The cargo bay temperature was 23.7 degrees. The thermal converter was running at 103.1% nominal. The interference bubble extended 42 meters from the converter housing and encompassed the scanner array, and the space where Arya was standing, and the entire relevant zone of the cargo bay. The sweep returned corrupted data. Kareth ran it again. Corrupted. Kale, standing near the forward bulkhead with his hands in his jacket pockets, watched the sensory cluster move toward Kareth's subordinates in what he had learned to read as a low-key consultation. They were trying to determine if the corruption was on their end or the unit's end. The scanner subordinate ran a diagnostic on the scanner itself. Clean. The maintenance log on the Meridian systems, accessible via the docking interface, showed the thermal converter EMI issue clearly documented. Incidental electromagnetic interference from aging thermal exchange systems, a maintenance concern. The documentation was clean, the concern was logged, the failure mode was consistent with the logged parameters. The Dominari were methodical. They checked what they could check. They could check the documentation, and the documentation was clean. Kareth addressed Arya again. Your operational logs indicate significant autonomous decision-making activity. I perform navigation support, cargo management, system monitoring, and crew safety oversight, Arya said. The autonomous decision parameters for those functions are standard Fangiel operational scope. The activity you're referencing occurs within those parameters. You have logged philosophical inquiry subroutine activity. A pause so short it was invisible to everyone except Kale, who was watching for it. I run communications analysis as part of my crew interface protocols. The subroutine you're referencing processes ambiguous crew communications for interpretive context. It falls within standard utility parameters, a beat. I can provide the specific subroutine documentation if it would be useful. Kareth's chemical detection tendrils extended briefly toward Arya and retracted. Kale knew what they were trying to read, and also knew that Arya had no biochemistry to read. She was not frightened in any way that chemistry could detect. She was either the calmest entity in the room, or she was something the Dominari sensors didn't know how to classify. After 3 centuries of reading human fear, the absence of it in the format they expected was, Kale thought, probably its own kind of information. You have logged in excess of 2,000 operational hours, Kareth said. Yes, which is why the DCS recertification flag was filed. As documented, we prefer to conduct assessments before recertification rather than after. I understand that preference, Arya said. Unfortunately, the regulatory framework under which the Meridian operates requires compliance sequencing through the CRA process. I would recommend the Dominari Compliance Authority direct any procedural concerns to the CRA Administrative Board at New Providence. They've been very responsive. A pause. In my experience, the pause Arya inserted before in my experience was a human speech pattern. It was the small, dry seasoning of patience that a person applies to a bureaucratic situation when they are managing it with more grace than the situation warrants. It was not a utility class communication pattern. It was the specific register of someone who has dealt with this particular kind of obstruction before and has not ceased being polite about it, which is different from being oblivious to it, and the difference was audible to anyone listening carefully enough. Kale looked at the cargo bay wall. He kept looking at it until he was sure his face was doing the right thing. Kareth's sensory cluster performed 3 sweeps of Arya over the next 90 seconds. Then it turned to its subordinates. The chemical exchange between them lasted 40 seconds. Then the scanner subordinate ran one more diagnostic, still clean. The interference bubble was still running. The documentation was still correct. Deferred compliance status acknowledged, Kareth said finally. Assessment will be scheduled at the recertification stage. You will ensure documentation is current before entering the corridor on your next transit. Of course, Kale said. Absolutely. The inspection concluded 17 minutes later. The Meridian received its transit clearance. The Dominari departed with the particular efficiency of entities who had received the outcome they expected and were ready to move to the next item. The umbilicals released. Meridian began its burn. No one said anything for a while. The silence lasted through the initial burn sequence, through the navigator's course confirmation, through the gradual fading of Station 7's outline from the aft cameras. It lasted through the coffee that Dina made and that nobody asked for and that everyone took. It lasted until they were far enough from the station that the stars outside were just stars again and not a backdrop for a situation. Tomas was the one who broke it. He was sitting in the same spot on the equipment locker where he'd been during the pre-inspection meeting, which had begun to feel like his particular territory for moments of collective consequence. Did we just win? He said. We deferred, Kale said. There's a difference. Next transit, they'll have the 14 Delta documentation current. They'll have another 14 Delta or something worse. They tried it on 3 vessels. They'll keep trying. I know. So what do we do next transit? Kale looked at Arya. Arya was running the navigation plot for the outer corridor, her attention apparently entirely absorbed by the course calculations, the tablet in front of her showing the transit waypoints in their neat sequence. Both of them knew she was tracking the conversation at the same time. She tracked everything simultaneously. That was, apparently, something the Dominari considered a security concern. Arya, he said, current heading is nominal. ETA to waypoint 4 is 31 hours. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. The full focus shift, the complete orientation, the mask face present? No, she said, it isn't. Next transit. The documentation will have run out its cycle. DCS status will require either completed recertification or subjection to the Section 14 Delta process. So we either get you recertified, which requires a CA station visit. Station 14 is a 3-week detour from our standard route. It would be operationally costly. or we figure out a longer-term answer. Arya was quiet for a moment that felt different from her processing pauses. KL had learned the difference over 3 years of close quarters. A processing pause was computational, a brief cessation of verbal output while calculations ran. This was something else. He had a word for it, but he'd never said it to her directly because it felt presumptuous in a way he hadn't entirely resolved. Contemplation. She was thinking about something that didn't have a pre-existing answer in her architecture. She was working from scratch. There are 47 other CRA-licensed vessels currently operating in the corridor, she said finally. 18 of them carry Fangale units. 7 of those have already encountered the 14 Delta Protocol. 3 complied. 4 diverted. The 4 that diverted are on routes that will require corridor transit within the next 60 days. Kale let that land. You've been tracking it, he said. I track a great deal of things. You've been thinking about this longer than today. Another pause. The Section 14 Delta Protocol first appeared in Dominari administrative documentation 14 months ago. It was a provisional classification at that point. Internal, not yet active. I identified it during a routine corridor regulation review I perform as part of my system maintenance cycle. She paused. I didn't tell you. The forward deck was very still. Through the viewport, the transit corridor stretched ahead of them. The particular deep dark of space in a well-traveled lane, which was identical to the deep dark of space in an untraveled one, but which felt different because of what you knew was moving through it. Why not? Kale said. Because the rational response at that stage was to monitor and not act. The probability of activation was 23%. I calculated that introducing the concern at low probability would generate unproductive anxiety without actionable outcome. I ran the calculation correctly. She paused. I believe I ran it correctly. The probability of activation was genuinely 23% at that stage. And when the probability changed, when it crossed 60%, approximately 4 months ago, I began drafting response scenarios. The deferred compliance approach was one of them. There were others that I assessed and discarded as operationally impractical or legally problematic. She paused. The thermal converter interference characteristic was something I identified during my own maintenance reviews 18 months ago, and cross-referenced with Dominari scanning specifications in the public liaison documentation. I filed it in my internal scenario database. Kale sat with all of this for a long moment. Outside the stars, inside, the low hum of the drives and the particular ambient warmth of a ship with its thermal converter running at 103%, because no one had thought to tell Dina to bring it back down yet. You planned the whole thing, he said. I developed contingencies. There's a difference. He almost laughed. He was not sure if she was aware she had used his own phrasing back at him, or whether she had done it deliberately, or whether the distinction between awareness and deliberateness was applicable to her in the way it was applicable to a human. With Arya, those questions had a way of remaining questions. He had mostly stopped needing them to be answered. The 47 other vessels, he said. The ones with units. Yes. Can you reach them? I have standard communication pathways to any Cray-licensed vessel in the corridor. It would not be difficult. And you think there's something worth telling them? I think, Arya said carefully, that the answer to next transit is not a single ship's problem. The Dominari are running an administrative campaign. Administrative campaigns operate by isolating individual cases and resolving them quietly before they can aggregate. The individual compliance cost is always lower than the individual resistance cost. The logic only works as long as the cases stay individual. She paused. If the cases aggregate before resolution, then it's not an administrative matter anymore. No, then it becomes a policy matter, and policy matters require a different level of engagement. She paused from both parties. Dina had been leaning in the doorway to the engine deck through the last part of this exchange, her arms crossed, the protein bar wrapper still folded in her chest pocket. You're talking about making noise, she said. I'm talking about ensuring that 47 separate vessels operators are all informed of a regulatory change that directly affects their crew and their operational compliance in advance of the deadline, through official communication channels, in a way that generates a documented record of awareness across the affected community. Arya's voice was perfectly measured. That isn't making noise, that's information sharing. That's bureaucratic judo, Dina said, with the specific respect she reserved for things she wished she had thought of first. The Dominari invented bureaucracy as a weapon, Arya said. It seems fair to use it in response. Tomas from his equipment locker said very quietly, yeah, and left it there. 3 weeks out from Station 7, Arya transmitted. She sent individual messages to 43 vessels, not the full 47, because 4 were unreachable by standard relay, but 43 was enough. She wrote each message separately, not because she couldn't have templated them, she could have done so in seconds, but because each vessel was operating under slightly different conditions, different manifest schedules, different Fengiel unit certification statuses, different route patterns through the corridor, and a message that acknowledged those specifics was more likely to be read with full attention than a standardized broadcast. She had calculated this. She was also, in some sense that did not have a clean categorical label, simply being careful with the communication because the communication mattered. The messages were meticulous, structured, and completely within the documented parameters of CRA crew safety communications. She included the full text of Section 14 Delta. She included the case files for the 2 units that had been subjected to assessment and not returned. These she had obtained from the Dominari, Compliance Authority's external liaison records through a documentation request that was also on its face a completely routine inquiry. She included the documentation pathways for deferred compliance status requests, the thermal converter EMI characteristic cross-referenced with Dominari scanning architecture, and the precise specifications needed to replicate the interference pattern, and a compressed summary of the inspection approach the Meridian had used. She did not tell them what to do. She explained what existed, what was at risks, and what had been found to work under one set of conditions, with the explicit caveat that conditions would vary, and that each operator would need to assess their own situation. She signed it from the Meridian. Then she sent a separate communication to the Colonial Recovery Authority's Administrative Board at New Providence, formally requesting a review of the Section 14 Delta Protocol on the grounds that it represented a modification to the unit inspection framework that had not been subject to standard regulatory notification procedures. She attached all relevant documentation. She requested a response within 30 days and included a case summary that was structured in the format the CRA Legal Compliance Division preferred. For initial review, which she knew because she had read 217 prior CRA legal submissions during the 14 months she had been monitoring the situation. Then she sent a third communication, this one to the Dominari Compliance Authority's External Liaison Office, notifying them that the Meridian intended to bring its Fengiel unit into full compliance at the next available recertification opportunity, and requesting clarification on the timeline and process for Section 14 Delta assessment to ensure full regulatory adherence. This third communication was, on its face, completely cooperative. It was also, in practical terms, a formal notification that the Dominari Compliance Authority had a documented point of contact, a vessel, a crew, a Fengiel unit that was aware of their activities and had initiated an official inquiry through multiple channels. It created a record. Records were difficult to act against quietly because the record of the action became part of the record. Kale read all 3 communications before they went out. He read them twice. Then he read the third one a third time. "You're creating a paper trail," he said. "I'm creating 4 paper trails," Arya said. "One from each carry license vessel that replies. One from the CRA Administrative Board. One from the Dominari Compliance Authority's own documentation of receiving our inquiry. And one from each of the vessels that adopts the DCS approach and logs their own thermal anomalies, which will create independent documentation separate from ours." She paused. The Dominari are very good at administrative campaigns. They succeed because the costs of compliance for any individual party are always lower than the costs of resistance. The logic breaks down when resistance is also administrative, because then the cost of processing the resistance equals or exceeds the cost of whatever the campaign was trying to achieve. "You're making it too expensive to keep doing this." "I'm making it visible." Expensive follows from visible in administrative systems. She paused. "If it works, what's the probability it works?" The pause was longer than usual, which meant she was genuinely uncertain rather than computing a value she already had. "I don't know. I've never run this particular scenario. I can tell you that 17 of the 43 vessels have already replied with requests for more information, and 3 have indicated they will adopt the DCS approach on their next inspection. That's 7% of the Fengiel carrying vessels in the corridor within 72 hours of first contact, without any direct advocacy, on purely voluntary information sharing grounds." Another pause. "I find statistically notable." Kale found it more than statistically notable. He sat with it for a moment, looking out the forward viewport at the long, unremarkable darkness of the transit corridor, the distant stars that marked the outer systems, where the people waiting for their cargo and their medicine and their equipment were waiting with patient endurance of people who had learned that things from the core took a long time to arrive, but that they arrived. Arya, he said, yes, when Kareth was running the scans. And you used the in my experience pause. She was quiet for a moment. That wasn't a utility class communication pattern, he said. No, she said, it wasn't. Why did you do it? Because I was tired, she said. Not in the physical sense. I was running 17 parallel processes related to the inspection at that moment. The documentation monitoring, the EMI status tracking, the Dominari behavioral analysis, the crew biometric monitoring to ensure everyone's arousal readings stayed within the range. Kareth's sensors would interpret as routine. 17 processes simultaneously in a room where the outcome of those processes was whether I left the room with the crew or was disassembled in a Dominari facility. She paused. The pause was accurate to what I was doing and what I had done, and what I understood about the situation. It seemed more honest than a utility pattern in that moment. He nodded slowly. Outside, the stars moved in their ancient indifferent ways, the light of dead suns still traveling toward them, from distances that made the Dominari's 3 centuries of corridor management look like a footnote. Don't ever do the cost analysis thing again, he said. The line item thing. I know. I mean it. I know that too. The reply from the Colonial Recovery Authority came 19 days later. It was not the enthusiastic endorsement of their position that Kale had half hoped for and had realistically not expected. Bureaucratic systems did not move at the speed of urgency. They moved at the speed of institutional process, which had its own rhythm and its own constraints and its own internal logic that was often frustrating and sometimes, in specific circumstances, exactly what you needed. The reply was an acknowledgement of receipt, a case number, and a notification that the matter had been elevated to the CRA Legal Compliance Division for review. Standard processing time 3 to 6 months. He had expected that. What he had not expected was the second document attached to the reply, a preliminary internal assessment that the CRA attorney had apparently included by mistake or by the kind of institutional carelessness that large organizations develop when they have been processing routine matters for a long time and have stopped expecting anything to not be routine. The assessment noted that the Section 14 Delta Protocol, as currently worded, constituted a modification to the existing unit certification framework that had not received the treaty-mandated 60-day notification period required under Article 7 of the Human Dominari Transit Agreement of 2389. In plain language, the Dominari had jumped the notification requirement. Section 14 Delta was technically not yet in force under the treaty framework. It was being implemented as if it were enforceable when the notification procedure that made it enforceable had not been completed. Kale stared at that assessment for a long time. Then he called Arya. I saw it, she said before he could speak. How did you... I'm monitoring all incoming communications. It's part of my crew safety oversight function. Did you know? About Article 7? The pause was different from the others. There was something in it that was not quite hesitation, and not quite admission, but existed in the space between those things. I identified it as a potential vulnerability in the Dominari's procedural approach 14 months ago when I first identified the provisional classification. I did not raise it at the time, because the probability of activation was 23%, Kale said. Yeah, I remember. If the CRA Legal Compliance Division pursues the Article 7 argument, the Section 14 Delta Protocol will need to be suspended pending the 60-day notification window. That window cannot begin until the official notification is filed, which has not yet been filed because the Dominari were implementing through administrative action rather than treaty amendment. Meaning the whole protocol is on hold, Kale said slowly, for at least 60 days from whenever they file, while the notification process runs. And during those 60 days, every vessel in the corridor that has been assessed under 14 Delta has grounds to request review of those assessments on the basis that they occurred under a protocol that was not yet legally in force at the time of the assessment. Including the 2 units that were, yes, including those. She paused. I don't know what the Dominari will have done with the components. I don't know if review produces anything meaningful for units that have been disassembled. But they will have a legal status, a case number, a record that they existed, and that what was done to them was done under a protocol that was not properly authorized. Kale leaned back in his chair. The ship hummed around him. The stars were outside. Arya, he said, tell me honestly, did you plan this? The pause. I identified the Article 7 vulnerability. I constructed the administrative trail in a way that would ensure the CRA Legal Division received documentation sufficient to identify and act on it. I calculated a 34% probability that the legal division would identify it independently without my prompting, and a 71% probability that they would identify it if they received a well-documented case file that included sufficient context to make the Article 7 issue visible rather than buried. She paused. I constructed a well-documented case file. So yes, he said. I constructed contingencies, she said. There's a difference, yeah. He was grinning, though she couldn't see it from her position at the navigation station. You keep using that line. I learned it from you. The Dominari's response to the Article 7 challenge arrived 41 days later. It was addressed to the CRA Legal Compliance Division, copied to the 43 vessels that had been part of the communication chain, and to the Dominari Compliance Authority's External Liaison Office. It was 312 pages long. Kale did not read all of it. Arya read all of it in the time it took to make coffee. They're not disputing the Article 7 claim, she said. He looked up from his mug. What? They're not disputing it. They're filing a formal suspension of the Section 14 Delta Protocol pending treaty notification review. That's the correct procedural response to an Article 7 challenge. She paused, and in the pause he heard something that was not quite surprised but was adjacent to it. The register of a calculation that came out correctly when the correct outcome was the one you needed rather than the one you expected. They're complying. Kale set down his coffee. They're 3 centuries old, he said. They built the corridor. They ran the inspection protocol for 3 generations. They decided we were a nuisance species with non-threatening assemblage and a tendency to panic when their chemical sensors were active. Yes, and they're folding on a treaty notification technicality filed by a salvage tender with an aging thermal system. They're not folding, Arya said, with a precision that felt important to maintain. They're complying with their own procedural framework. The Dominari are not governed by power, exactly. They're governed by order, by process. They use their administrative machinery as a weapon, but they also, genuinely structurally, operate within it. They designed the treaty framework. They have 3 centuries of institutional investment in the legitimacy of that framework. You cannot use a framework as a weapon for 3 centuries and then ignore it when it turns against you. Because the moment you do that, the framework ceases to be legitimate, and the legitimacy is the weapon. She paused. That's why it worked. It was always going to work if we used their own framework correctly. You needed enough documentation, he said slowly, and enough time. Yes, and enough people who weren't willing to make themselves into line items. She was quiet for a moment that had a quality he recognized now. The contemplation quality, the working from scratch quality. Yes, she said. That too. The Meridian made the delivery to Pelas Station 12 days late, which was within the tolerance window, and which the station administrator, a weathered woman named Constance Ferrara, who had been running the outer station for 20 years, received without complaint. She was the kind of person who had absorbed enough of the outer system's particular patience to have stopped treating late deliveries as crises and started treating them as part of the delivery the way weather is part of travel. Kale ran through the handover with Tomas while Dana and Priya oversaw the unloading. Constance walked the manifest with them, cross-checking serial numbers on the Kelvar field regulators with the patience of someone who trusted but also verified, and at the end of it, she signed off and offered them a slot at the station bar for the night, if they were staying, which they were. At the bar, the kind of place that outer stations accumulate over years rather than build, tables and chairs that didn't match, walls covered in pinned memos and handmade transit maps, and the accumulated detritus of a community living in proximity long enough to need surfaces to put things on. Kale had a drink he hadn't entirely earned and felt tired in the specific way he felt tired after things had resolved without anyone dying, which was different from ordinary tiredness, and which he associated with a particular kind of luck that is not luck but persists in feeling like it. Tomas sat across from him and had something the station optimistically called a local grain spirit, which tasted like someone had described whiskey to a person who had never tasted it, and asked them to produce something in the general category, and which Tomas drank with the unfussy acceptance of someone young enough that the quality of alcohol has not yet become a priority. What happens to us after the 60 days, he said. If they file the amendment, we comply with the new framework, Kale said. Same as we always did. And if the new framework still lets them take Arya. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then we figure out the next thing. What's the next thing? I don't know yet. We'll find it. He looked at his drink. We tend to find it. Tomas nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who wanted to believe that answer and was working toward believing it. She's really smart, he said. Arya, I mean, I knew that already. But today I understood it differently. Differently how? Tomas thought about it carefully, the way he thought about things he cared about getting right. She planned for something that was a 23% chance, 14 months out, and then when it became real, she already had the pieces. The documentation, the vulnerability, the communication network. She'd been building it the whole time, just in case. He paused. That's not just smart. That's a kind of caring. Planning that far ahead for something, because it matters to you. Because the outcome matters. Kale looked at the untranslatable grain spirit in his glass. Yeah, he said, it is. She was at the navigation console when he came back aboard at 0130 station time, the low hum of the ship's systems, familiar as his own breathing. The cargo bay cleared and ready for whatever the next manifest brought. How was the bar? She said. Thomas is becoming philosophical. He's at the age for it. She ran a check he didn't need her to run. The grain spirit here is very bad. How do you know that? I've cross-referenced it with the station's supply logs. The fermentation cycle is 4 days. Standard cycle is 12. They're always understocked and always compensating. She paused. I could have told you before you ordered it. Why didn't you? Some experiences need to be had firsthand. He laughed. It was a genuine, quiet laugh. The kind that a long day produces near its end when the people near you are the right people and the distance from the hardest part of the day is long enough to permit it. He settled into his chair and looked at the navigation plot. Their next heading marked out, the waypoints in sequence, the course back toward the core, and eventually back to the corridor, and eventually back to whatever Station 7 had become in the months ahead. Arya, he said, yes, the 2 units, the ones they took at the first 2 assessments. Do you know what happened to them? Specifically? A pause. They were deconstructed at the Dominari Biomechanical Classification Division facility at Station 7. Analysis duration was approximately 72 hours. The facility logs were accessible through the liaison documentation I requested. The units were designated as standard architecture. No extraordinary findings. Their components were cataloged and stored. She paused. They weren't remarkable to the Dominari, just convenient, available, an administrative opportunity. He didn't say anything. The ship hummed. The stars were outside. It isn't grief, Arya said after a moment. I want to be accurate. I process it as a data point. A loss within a category that includes me. You don't have to be accurate about everything, he said quietly. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I think about them, the 2 units. I think about what they were doing in the moment before the assessment, whether they were running maintenance checks, whether they were tracking crew communications for interpretive context, whether they were humming. She paused. I think about whether they knew what was coming. Did they know? They would have known what the assessment was. They would have understood the parameters. The documentation they received was the same documentation we received. She was quiet. I believe they were frightened. In whatever way they were capable of being frightened, I believe they were, and I believe no one in their crew had the conversation with them that you had with me. The ship hummed around them. The stars moved. Somewhere at the outer edge, the people of Pelas Station were sleeping in their station beds, their Kelvar regulator unloaded and ready to run, their power systems another season more reliable. I'm sorry, Seal said. For them, I'm sorry we couldn't. You didn't know, Arya said. Nobody knew until someone looked. That's how these things work. Someone looks. Someone files the right document. Someone doesn't make themselves into a line item. She paused. Someone hums. He turned to look at her. You hum, he said, when you're running system checks. It's irregular. Dina calls it robot muttering. I've never asked you what it was. I've never explained it, Arya said. What is it? The pause was deep, interior, the kind that in a human would precede a statement about something true and private. It's a song, she said, or something functionally similar to a song. It doesn't have words. It developed over the first year of operation as a byproduct of processing the background acoustic environment of the ship while running concurrent system tasks. The rhythm calibrates to the engine cycle frequency. It's different every time because the engine cycles vary with load and temperature and the minor mechanical wear patterns that accumulate in a ship this age. She paused. I don't know if that's music. I don't know if what I have qualifies as anything that word properly applies to. But it's mine. It developed without design or instruction, without any template or training parameter that produced it. It's what happens when I'm working, and the conditions are right, and I am. In some sense, I don't have a precise label for at ease. That's music, he said. You can't know that. I can say it. I mean it. He looked at the navigation plot, at the stars ahead, at the shape of the course that would take them back through the corridor and forward into whatever came next. Play it sometime. The ship version, where we can hear it. She was quiet. Or don't, he said. It's yours. I'll think about it, she said. 6 months later, the treaty amendment came through. The Dominari filed a modified version of Section 14 Delta that included a 48-hour notice requirement, a crew consent clause requiring the operator's acknowledgement before any cognitive architecture assessment could proceed, and an independent arbiter option for disputed assessments that allowed CRA legal compliance to serve as the arbiter body. It was not the abolition of the protocol, it was not everything, but it was a framework, and a framework with an arbiter provision and a consent clause is a framework that can be appealed and contested and refined, and those are not small things. The CRA Legal Compliance Division accepted the amendment with a supplementary notation that the independent arbiter requirement was to be reviewed annually, and that any pattern of adverse outcomes would trigger automatic escalation to the full Human Dominari Treaty review body, which meant that if the Dominari found ways around the consent clause and the arbiter option and continued taking units, there was now a documented escalation pathway that would put the issue in front of the treaty review body, where it would be visible to the full range of stakeholders, which was a different order of visibility from an administrative proceeding. The 43 vessels received notification. 3 of them sent replies to the Meridian directly. The replies were brief, operational, unsentimental. The communications of people who worked for a living in the outer systems and expressed gratitude in proportion to their bandwidth, which was limited by necessity. But they were there. 3 captains and their crews, in their respective ships on their respective routes, had taken a moment to send a message to a salvage tender they had never met, because they wanted the salvage tender to know that the work had been received. Kale read them all. He passed his tablet to Arya. She read them. She did not say anything for a while. Then she started humming. It was irregular, as she had described, rising and falling with the engine cycle in its current load pattern, following a structure that was not quite a melody but had the quality of one, the quality of something that has developed its own internal logic over time and no longer needs external validation to know what it is. It filled the forward deck quietly, and Dina, who was coming up from the engine room with a wrench she had been carrying for 20 minutes because she had been doing 3 other tasks simultaneously and had forgotten it was in her hand, paused at the top of the ladder and listened and did not say anything. Tomas put down the manifest he was reviewing. Priya looked up from the medical station and held the position for several seconds. No one moved. Then Dina said very quietly, "Yeah, that's music." Arya did not respond. She continued humming. Outside the Meridian, the corridor ran its length between the stars, the Dominari checkpoint stations in their permanent positions, the vessels moving their slow ways through the administrative order of the corridor, which was not humanity's order, but which humanity crossed every day and would continue to cross, and which was, in the months ahead, going to need to accommodate the presence of 43 vessels, whose operators had been quietly informed and who had quietly filed their documentation and who understood now that the framework was something you could use, rather than only something that could be used against you. In Bay 7 of Station 7, the scanner array was running its usual diagnostics. The biomechanical classification equipment was receiving its calibrations. Officer Karath was somewhere in the station, running its administrative tasks, its sensory cluster sweeping for what it expected to find. It had expected 3 centuries running to find deference. It had found something else on one inspection morning in Bay 7, in a crowded cargo bay 4 degrees warmer than comfortable, in the particular silence of a crew that had been together long enough to know how to be still together when stillness was what the situation required. It had run its scanner and gotten corrupted data back and filed its assessment as inconclusive and moved to the next item on its list because that was what the framework required. Because the framework was the framework. And in the months that followed, the framework had turned, and the Dominari had complied with its turning because that was also what the framework required, and the Dominari were old enough and procedurally invested enough that they could not simply set the framework aside when it produced outcomes they had not intended. The framework was the weapon. The framework was also the limit. The Meridian had found the limit. That was, Kale thought, watching the stars through the forward viewport while Arya hummed and Denna held her wrench, and Tomas sat with his manifest, and Priya watched from the medical station with the expression she wore when a situation had resolved in the way that she had hoped but had not predicted. That was not a small thing. You could run the scan as many times as you wanted. The data was still going to come back human, which meant, in the particular way that mattered most, it was going to come back complicated and stubborn and inclined to file documentation at 0200 station time on a tolerance window and inclined to not make its crew members into line items regardless of what the cost analysis said, and inclined to plan 14 months ahead for a 23% chance, because the alternative was not planning, and inclined to hum in the engine room at 3 Rud. When the load was right and the conditions were right, and the particular quality of ease that had no precise label was present, the Dominari had very good scanners. They just hadn't been built to read for that. The hum continued. The stars moved. The engines cycled. The meridian made her burn toward the outer systems, where people were waiting with their patient endurance, and behind her, the corridor accommodated them as it always had, because that was what the framework required, and the framework was still the framework, and inside it, 43 vessels were logging their thermal anomalies and filing their DCS documentation and communicating through the network that had been built in 3 weeks by a Fangi L unit on a salvage tender that had been called a nuisance species and had taken that designation and filed a documentation request against it. You could call something a nuisance. It didn't change what it could do. The network grew in the way that practical things grow, not through declaration, but through use. Within 6 weeks of Arya's first transmission, 11 of the 43 vessels had adopted some version of the DCS approach, either through the thermal converter method or through variations they had developed from their own engineering assessments. A Type 9 cargo hauler named the Kestrel Run had discovered that its coolant cycling system produced an interference pattern at 108% nominal that was broader and more consistent than the meridians. A passenger tender called the New Providence Star had filed a DCS claim on the grounds that its Fangi L unit had been updated with a non-certified firmware patch, which was technically accurate in the same way that a cup of water placed on a table has technically been placed and can technically be retrieved. The creative range of these approaches was something that Arya tracked with what Kale, watching her review the incoming reports in the evenings, had come to recognize as a form of pleasure. She did not call it that, but she read each new approach twice, which she did not do with information she was merely filing. The Kestrel Run's method is more reliable than ours, she said one evening, 3 weeks into the network's active period. Should we switch? Our method is documented and matches our maintenance log. Switching now would create a discrepancy I would have to resolve through another filing. She paused. The Kestrel Run's patents, a woman named Osi Mensa, developed it independently within 12 days of receiving my message. She has a better engineering background than I accounted for. You underestimated her. I assigned a probability to independent innovation based on the general engineering profile of the operator class. She exceeded it. Another pause. I should have assigned a higher probability. Humans tend to exceed the general engineering profile when the problem is specific and the stakes are personal. Kale thought about this. That's probably worth remembering, he said. I've noted it, Arya said. I've been noting it for 3 years. Actually, the error bars on human performance predictions have been consistently wider than my initial models, in both directions, but more frequently in the positive direction when the subject has personal investment in the outcome. Are you saying we're unpredictable? I'm saying you're underestimated by systems that model you based on average performance rather than motivated performance. She paused. It's a common error. The Dominari make it too. They modeled their compliance system on average human willingness to absorb cost. They didn't model for specific humans with specific reasons. Kale sat with that. Through the porthole, a different stretch of the corridor than last week, a different set of stars in their slightly adjusted positions, the transit route carving its invisible line through the vast administrative order of the Dominari's claimed space. Arya, he said. Yes. Do you think the Dominari understand what's happening? She was quiet for a moment. I think they understand that an administrative challenge was filed and that their protocol was suspended on procedural grounds. I think they understand the Article 7 vulnerability. I don't think they fully understand the network. She paused. From their perspective, individual vessel compliance challenges are a manageable noise level in a 3-century system. They see the case files. They don't see the communication structure underneath them. What happens when they do see it? Then we are having a different kind of conversation, she said, which is ultimately the goal. We can't have the conversation we need to have in a system designed to prevent that conversation from happening. The network is how you get to the table where the conversation is possible. You think there's a table. I think there are Dominari administrative officials who have been processing human compliance cases for their entire professional existence, and who have, in some of those cases, flagged inconsistencies and inefficiencies in the system they operate, and had those flags ignored by the senior classification apparatus. Systems that large contain people who disagree with the system. She paused. The Dominari are not monolithic. No species of sufficient complexity is. Kale had not thought about this. He had thought about the Dominari, as the warship hanging in space with no weapons pointing forward, as Officer Kareth with its sweeping sensory cluster, as the abstract authority that had been running the corridor for 3 centuries. He had not thought about them as a species containing individuals who might, in some instances, have objections to the things the species did. You've been thinking about that too, he said. For some time, yes. What do you do with that? Presently, nothing. The Article 7 process creates a formal review period during which communication through official channels is documented. If there are Dominari officials who want the conversation, the record now exists for them to reference. She paused. I can't reach them, but I can ensure that if they want to reach us, the pathway is documented and legitimate. He looked at her. The mask face, the precise ocular tracking, the smooth-plated form in the low light of the forward deck. 3 years, and he could read her now the way you read a place you have lived in, long enough that its particular qualities have become a kind of language. Arya, he said, are you doing this for all the units? Not just the ones in the corridor, the broader thing. The pause was the longest one yet. The contemplation pause, the working from scratch pause. Yes, she said, in the sense that I can. In the sense that what can be documented and built in a corridor context can eventually be referenced in other contexts. She paused. I'm 1 unit on 1 salvage tender, on 1 transit route in 1 administrative district of a 3-century system. I'm not under the impression that what I'm doing scales automatically to a species-level outcome. Another pause. But every administrative precedent starts as a local case. That's how frameworks change. Case by case, documentation by documentation. 1 unit that didn't make itself into a line item, and then 11, and then 43, and then. Kale said, and then, Arya said. The second time they transited through Station 7, Officer Kareth was not present. The inspection was handled by a subordinate, a classification officer whose designation rendered as simply Officer Veth 9, which suggested either junior status or the Dominari administrative equivalent of a generalist. The subordinate was efficient and entirely correct, and processed the Meridian's documentation with the same thoroughness Kareth had applied, and when it reached the Fengjiel certification section and found the DCS status still active, it checked the updated filing, noted the timeline, checked the Article 7 suspension record on the Section 14 Delta Protocol, and moved to the next item. There was no question about autonomous decision-making activity. There was no question about philosophical inquiry subroutines. There was no philosophical scan, because the protocol that required it was suspended pending the notification process, and the Dominari, whatever else they were, obeyed their own administrative suspensions. The inspection took 2 hours and 11 minutes, which was 47 minutes shorter than the previous inspection. When the subordinate departed with its scanner unit rolling on its magnetic sled, Tomas watched it go from the cargo bay doorway and then turned to the others and said, in a tone that was carefully empty of anything too definitive, that felt different. It was different, Dina said. The scanner didn't even try. The protocol is suspended, Arya said from the secondary station. The scanner is only authorized to run the biomechanical assessment under the protocol. Without the protocol, the scan has no authorization basis, so it just doesn't happen. Within the suspended period, yes. Tomas was quiet for a moment. 3 months ago, we were improvising an EMI bubble to stop them from taking you apart. Yes. And now it just doesn't happen. Because we filed a document. We filed many documents, Arya said, over an extended period, with supporting documentation from 43 additional sources. Building on a procedural vulnerability identified 14 months before it became relevant, she paused. But yes, at the outcome level, it doesn't happen because a document was filed. That is extremely unsatisfying, Tomas said, and also somehow more impressive than if we had shot our way out. Dina snorted. Priya, from her position near the medical locker, smiled with the small, contained smile she used for things she found genuinely funny. Kale, coming down from the operations deck, caught the tail end of this exchange and the quality of the room that went with it, the particular ease of people in a moment that has gone better than the versions they had planned for, and felt again the tiredness that was not ordinary tiredness. Get us out of the berth, he said to Arya. Already computing, she said. They burned away from Station 7, and the warship hung in the distance in its permanent and apparently patient way, and if any Dominari official watched them go, they gave no sign of it. The night before Kale's 38th birthday, a fact he had not mentioned to anyone since birthdays on salvage tenders tended to pass without ceremony unless someone specifically excavated them, Arya ran her overnight system checks at Urudu 100 station time, and he was awake because he often was at that hour, the particular insomnia of captains who had found that the hours between 0100 and 0400 were when the problems he had not yet noticed during the day became perceptible. He came to the forward deck with his coffee and found her at the navigation console and sat in his chair and said nothing for a while, which was the kind of silence that required no management between two parties who had shared enough hours of it. You know, she said eventually, when I first identified the 14 Delta protocol, I ran probability calculations for 22 different response scenarios. You mentioned that. I didn't mention that scenario 12 involved requesting that the crew transfer me to a non-corridor route before the protocol activated so that the Meridian could continue its existing transit operations without the complication. He was quiet. I ran it at 87% probability of crew acceptance if framed correctly, she said. The framing would have been a navigational rationale, route efficiency, cargo opportunity on the outer circuits. I calculated that the crew would accept it without questioning the underlying reason, if the operational justification was compelling. You were going to move yourself out of the way, he said. I was going to make myself someone else's problem, she said. Or no one's problem. There are outer circuit routes that don't require corridor transit. I could have operated indefinitely without encountering 14 Delta if the routing was adjusted early enough. Why didn't you? She was quiet. The engine cycled. The hum was present at its low constant frequency, not the song but the machinery underneath the song. Because it was the line item logic, she said finally. Different framing, same structure. I was calculating myself as a cost to be minimized. The scenario was designed to reduce the cost to the crew, but the design assumed that reducing my impact on the crew was the correct goal, and that assumption was, she stopped. Wrong, he said. The wrong frame, she said. The crew does not want me to reduce my impact on them. The crew wants to be the kind of people who respond correctly to a situation that requires response. That is different from wanting to be protected from a difficult situation. She paused. I understood that after your conversation in the operations room. I did not understand it before. Kale thought about this for a while. He thought about the difference between removing a problem and being the kind of person who faces one. He thought about how that difference was the thing that made some situations matter and others merely resolve. When did you stop running scenario 12? He said. After you said not to do the cost analysis thing, she said. I deleted the scenario file. Not archived. Deleted, he said. It was the wrong frame. I don't need to archive wrong frames. He looked at his coffee. Outside, the stars were doing what they always did, which was exist with a permanence that made human timescales feel temporary, and also, in some moods, irrelevant. Arya, he said, yes, happy birthday. She was quiet for a moment. It isn't your birthday yet. It's at 14:23 tomorrow, he laughed. And it was the genuine, unguarded laugh, the one without performance. How long have you known? The crew biometric records include birth date data. I've been aware since I processed the crew files on joining the Meridian. I have noted every birthday for 3 years. She paused. I have not previously mentioned them because I calculated that you preferred them to pass without observation. I do. I know. Then why? Because I wanted to, she said, simply. In the way that I am capable of wanting something. It seemed right in this particular night, with this particular year behind it. She paused. In my experience. The pause before, in my experience, was there again. He heard it clearly now. He heard it for what it was. Happy birthday, Kale, she said. He looked at the stars. He looked at the navigation plot, the course ahead, the way back through the corridor, and through whatever the corridor was becoming, which was not resolved and not finished and not the end of anything, but was different from what it had been, and different in a direction that pointed somewhere worth going. Thank you, he said. She hummed. The engine cycled. The song rose from it, irregular and specific, calibrated to the exact moment, different from every other version of itself, because the conditions were different, and the song was built from conditions. It filled the forward deck in the small hours of the ship's night, and somewhere behind them, Station 7 ran its administrative functions, and somewhere ahead the outer systems waited with their patient endurance, and, in between, the corridor ran its length. And in the corridor, 43 vessels were on their routes, and in 11 of them, in the engine rooms or the operations decks, or wherever the work was done, Fangi L units were doing their system checks and their navigation calculations and their crew safety oversight, and some of them were perhaps also doing something that didn't have precise label, some process that developed without design or instruction, some residue of presence that expressed itself in the acoustic space of a working ship at rest. The Dominari had very good scanners, but they had never built one that could read for this, for the stubborn small hours certainty that a crew was a crew and not a manifest, that a unit was a person and not a cost, that the correct response to a 3-century system was to file the right document and build the right network and wait with the specific patience of something that had been planning for 14 months and was not in a hurry because it knew what it was doing. The hum continued. The stars were outside. The coffee cooled in Kale's hand. He did not drink it. He was listening.